September 20, 1944. On the wide, fast waters of the Waal River in the Netherlands, a line of small canvas boats pushed out from the southern bank in broad daylight. Crammed inside them were American paratroopers, packed shoulder to shoulder, gripping their rifles. They had perhaps 400 yards of open river to cross, and not a scrap of cover anywhere on it. On the far bank waited German gunners in prepared positions, and the moment the boats touched the water, the whole far shore seemed to erupt. There was nowhere to hide and no way back. There was only the far side and the long, terrible minutes it would take to reach it. It was one of the most desperate river crossings ever attempted by American troops. The boats were flimsy things of canvas and wood, meant to be rowed by trained engineers. Instead, they were jammed with paratroopers who had never handled a boat in their lives, and there were not even enough paddles to go around. Men dug at the water with their rifle butts to drive the boats forward. Around them, the river boiled with machine gun fire and bursting shells, and boat after boat was hit. Yet they kept paddling into the storm because everything depended on reaching the other side. Leading the assault from one of the boats was a young officer named Major Julian Cook. As his men paddled into the firestorm, Cook is said to have prayed aloud, over and over, in rhythm with the strokes, turning a Hail Mary into a desperate cadence to keep the boats moving. These men were not supposed to be sailors. They were paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division, soldiers who jumped from airplanes, now thrown into a daylight river crossing that more cautious officers had called suicide. The question that hangs over the Waal is a simple one. Why would anyone order such a thing? What could possibly be worth sending lightly armed paratroopers across an open river in daylight into the teeth of a waiting enemy? The answer lay a short distance upstream in a great bridge that had become one of the most important pieces of ground in all of Europe. To understand why those men climbed into those boats and what their courage would and would not buy, we have to go back a few days to one of the boldest and most ambitious plans the Allies ever attempted in the whole of the Second World War, and to the great prize that waited at the end of it. To understand the crossing of the Waal, we first have to understand the enormous gamble it was part of, a daring plan to end the war in Europe by Christmas, a plan now remembered by a haunting name, a bridge too far. By September 1944, the Allied armies had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France and Belgium toward Germany. Hoping to end the war quickly, the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed a bold stroke called Operation Market Garden. Thousands of paratroopers would drop deep behind German lines in the occupied Netherlands and seize a chain of bridges over the region's many rivers and canals. Then a powerful armored column would race up a single highway, cross those captured bridges one after another, and burst over the Rhine into Germany itself. It was daring, imaginative, and breathtakingly risky. Everything depended on speed and on the bridges. If even one of them was lost, the whole advance could stall, leaving the lightly armed paratroopers stranded far ahead of help. The American 101st Airborne took the southern bridges. The British 1st Airborne drew the farthest objective of all, the Great Bridge at Arnhem, and in the middle, the American 82nd Airborne, under General James Gavin, was given the town of Nijmegen and its enormous bridge across the River Waal, the widest water on the entire route. Without the Nijmegen Bridge, nothing beyond it could be reached. The bridge at Nijmegen was a giant, a long steel highway bridge spanning hundreds of yards of broad, powerful river. The Germans knew exactly how vital it was, and they had no intention of giving it up. They packed the far end and the approaches with troops, machine guns, and artillery, and wired the bridge itself to be destroyed. When the men of the 82nd tried to seize it from the southern town side in the first days of the operation, they ran into fierce resistance and were thrown back. The bridge stayed firmly in German hands, and precious time was slipping away. Every hour the bridge held, the situation grew more desperate. For far to the north, the British paratroopers at Arnhem were fighting for their lives and running out of time. General Gavin realized that attacking the bridge from only one end would never work. The enemy had to be hit from both sides at once, and so he settled on an idea so bold it bordered on madness. A force of his paratroopers would cross the wide wall downstream, in daylight, in boats, storm the far bank, and seize the far end of the bridge from behind, while others attacked across it from the town. All he needed now were the boats, and the men willing to do it. It was a plan that asked the impossible. The stretch of river the paratroopers would have to cross was about 400 yards wide, with a strong current, and the northern bank beyond it was open and flat, offering no cover at all. Worse, the crossing would be made in the middle of the afternoon, in full view of a dug-in enemy. There would be no darkness to hide in, and no surprise to rely on. The men who studied the plan understood at once how brutal it would be. Some openly called it suicide. But with the clock running down and the bridge still held, there was no time left for a safer way. The job fell to the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment and to the men of its 3rd Battalion in particular. The boats they were promised turned out to be small, fragile craft of canvas stretched over wooden frames, the kind meant to ferry engineers across quiet streams, not to carry assault troops over a great river under fire. Worse, the boats were delayed for hours in the terrible traffic on the single crowded highway behind the front. When they finally arrived, there were too few of them, and the paratroopers, trained to jump from planes rather than paddle boats, had only minutes to learn how to use them. Major Julian Cook would lead the assault wave across. A devout and determined officer, he gathered his men along the riverbank, hidden behind a roadway and a thin screen of smoke, and looked out at the wide water they would have to cross. Every man could see the far bank. Every man could imagine what was waiting there. They loaded into the canvas boats, around a dozen or more men crammed into each one, with a few engineers to help steer. There were not enough paddles, so some men made ready to row with the butts of their rifles. Then they waited for the signal, hearts pounding, in the last quiet moments before the storm. To blind the German gunners, Allied guns and tanks fired smoke shells along the far bank, trying to throw a grey curtain across the river. But the wind tugged at the smoke and tore holes in it, and in places it drifted away to nothing, leaving the water bare and open. The men in the boats knew the screen would not save them. They were about to paddle into the open in slow, crowded, fragile boats, straight at an enemy who could hardly miss. It went against every instinct a soldier had, and yet, when the order finally came, not a man held back from the water's edge. In the middle of the afternoon, the order was given, and the first wave of boats was carried down to the water's edge and pushed out into the current. The moment they cleared the bank, the far shore came alive. Machine guns opened up, mortar bombs splashed and burst among the boats, and shells threw up tall columns of water. The paratroopers bent to their paddles and dug at the river with everything they had. The crossing of the Waal had begun, and there was no turning back now. Ahead lay 400 yards of open water and the longest few minutes of their young lives. What followed was a scene almost beyond imagining. The wide river churned under a hail of fire, its surface lashed into spray. The little canvas boats, packed with men, crept across with agonizing slowness, far too slow for anyone's nerves. Some boats were hit and began to sink. Others spun out of control as the men handling the paddles were struck down, and others snatched the paddles from their hands and pulled on. Through all of it, the survivors kept stroking, kept driving toward the far bank, their single thought to get across and off the terrible open water. In Major Cook's boat, the young officer set a rhythm to steady his men, praying the words of the Hail Mary aloud, again and again, one line for each stroke of the paddle. Hail Mary, full of grace, and pull. Holy Mary, Mother of God, and pull. The simple, steady cadence gave the frightened men something to hold on to, a beat to paddle by in the chaos. All around them the river was a nightmare of noise and spray and falling men. But foot by foot, stroke by stroke, the boats that were still afloat clawed their way closer to the northern shore. The cost of those minutes on the water was terrible. Of the boats that set out in the first wave, only about half would survive to make the return trip for the next load of men. Many paratroopers never reached the far side at all, and yet the assault did not break. The boats that made it ground onto the muddy northern bank, and the survivors threw themselves out and into the shallows, soaked, exhausted, and filled with a cold and furious resolve. They had crossed the Waal. Now came the second half of their task, and in many ways the deadliest part still lay ahead of them. The men who reached the far shore did not pause to catch their breath. Driven by fear and fury, and the memory of friends lost on the water, they charged straight across the open ground beyond the bank, toward the German positions dug in along a raised embankment. It was a wild, headlong assault by men who had already passed through the worst, and felt they had nothing left to lose. They overran one position after another in close, desperate fighting, and the defenders, stunned that anyone had crossed that river at all, began to give way before the sheer fury of the attack. Having seized the bank, the paratroopers pressed on toward their true objectives, the northern ends of the great rail and road bridges that crossed the Waal. They fought their way across the open fields and dikes, clearing the far approaches one by one, until at last small groups of exhausted Americans reached the northern end of the bridges and held on. They had done the impossible part. They had taken the enemy's own side of the river. Now, everything depended on whether the attack across the bridge itself, from the town behind them, could break through to meet them. While the paratroopers fought on the far bank, a combined force of American infantry and British tanks launched their own assault across the great road bridge from the southern town side. It was a charge straight toward the muzzles of the German guns, across a long exposed span wired with explosives that might blow at any second. Tanks rumbled out onto the bridge, firing as they went, with infantry crowding behind them. The defenders fought back hard, but the sight of paratroopers suddenly attacking from the far end threw them into confusion at the worst possible moment. Caught between the men who had crossed the river and the force charging over the bridge, the German defense began to crack. The waiting demolition charges, for reasons still debated to this day, never brought the bridge down. As evening fell on September 20, the leading British tanks rolled the length of the great Nijmegen bridge and across to the northern bank, linking up at last with the battered, triumphant paratroopers who had crossed the Waal in their boats. Against every expectation, the bridge had been taken whole. It was an extraordinary feat of arms, paid for in the blood of the men on the water. For the survivors, the meeting on the far bank was a moment of fierce, grim pride, shadowed by grief for all who had not made it. Dozens of paratroopers had died in the crossing and the fighting beyond it, and many more were wounded. The men of the 504th had been asked to do something very nearly impossible, and they had done it. Hardened soldiers who saw the Waal crossing never forgot it. Even the British tank crews paddle into that wall of fire spoke of it afterward with open astonishment as one of the bravest things they had ever seen. And yet, even in that hour of triumph, something was wrong. The men who had bled to take the bridge expected the armored column to come thundering across at once and race north to rescue the British paratroopers fighting for their lives at Arnhem, only a few miles farther on. The bridge was open. The road beyond it was nearly clear, but the great advance did not roar onward into the night as the paratroopers had expected. Instead, almost unbelievably to the men who had just crossed that river, the tanks rolled to a halt. The reasons for that pause have been argued over ever since. The tankers were exhausted, short of infantry support, and wary of pushing a narrow armored column up a single exposed road in the dark. Whatever the cause, the delay proved costly. Far to the north at Arnhem, the British paratroopers had seized the northern end of their bridge and held it with unbelievable courage, waiting for the relief that was supposed to come. It never reached them in time. Overwhelmed and out of ammunition, the survivors at Arnhem were at last forced to surrender or slip away. The final bridge, the one over the Rhine, had been a bridge too far. Operation Market Garden, for all its boldness, fell short of its great goal. The Rhine would not be crossed until the following spring, at a place called Nijmegen, and the war in Europe would grind on into 1945. But the men who crossed the Waal had not bled for nothing. Their impossible assault had taken one of the most important bridges in Europe and broken the German hold on Nijmegen, and their courage became a legend in the airborne forces. Years later, their story reached millions through the book and film that gave the whole operation its enduring name, A Bridge Too Far. So why would anyone cross an open river in canvas boats in daylight into the fire of a waiting enemy? In the end, the answer is the oldest one in war, because they were asked to, because the men beside them were going, and because some were ahead, others were counting on them. The crossing of the Waal stands as one of the bravest acts of the entire Second World War. A few hundred men paddling into a storm of fire and coming out the other side. Today, a quiet line of lights crosses a bridge at Nijmegen each evening, in memory of the men who fell on that water. If your family served in the Airborne, jumped into Holland, or fought anywhere in that long campaign, share their name in the comments. So many never came home. The least we can do is remember them by name.